Does it ever feel like the scales of justice in America tip a little more for some than for others?
Mm-hmm.
Like, maybe wealth buys you a different kind of legal experience.
It certainly seems that way sometimes.
Today, we're navigating a really complex and honestly often unsettling part of the American legal landscape.
Yeah, this apparent split, this divergence in how the system seems to treat the rich and powerful versus, well, the poor and marginalized.
Exactly. And our exploration today, it pulls from news articles, investigative reports, legal documents, trying to get a handle on this.
It's a complicated picture, definitely.
And we also wanted to give a quick mention to Mindful Moments. It's this interesting YouTube channel.
Oh, yeah. What's that about?
They use AI to analyze books, and it offers these insights that really encourage reflection, critical thinking. Sort of like what we're aiming for today.
That sounds pretty relevant then, because the perspectives here are just so fundamentally different, aren't they?
How so?
Well, someone who's financially secure, they might just not grasp how easily someone living in poverty can get tangled up in the system over minor stuff.
Right. Things that wouldn't even register for someone else.
And conversely, people struggling day to day might have no idea about the sheer scale of financial misconduct that can happen at the top.
You mean like white-collar crime?
Yeah, but often without any real personal consequences for the people involved. It's almost invisible if you're not looking for it.
That difference really hits home when you look at specific cases, like the Abacus Federal Savings Bank.
Oh, the bank in Chinatown.
Yeah, a small family-run bank. And incredibly, the only bank criminally prosecuted after the 2008 financial crisis.
And the kicker is they face charges after they themselves reported problems with mortgage fraud internally.
It just sounds backwards, doesn't it? They flag an issue and they get prosecuted.
Right, so it immediately makes you wonder, why them? Why this small bank that actually tried to address the issue?
Especially when you compare it to the giants.
Exactly. Look at the huge civil settlements the big banks paid for, similar or arguably much worse behavior related to the crisis.
You're talking Citigroup, Bank of America.
Yeah, Citigroup paid, what, $968 million? Bank of America, $6.8 billion. Wells Fargo, $3.3 billion. JP Morgan Chase, another $3.3 billion.
Huge sums of money, but civil settlements.
Key difference. Civil, not criminal. No criminal charges against those institutions. Billions paid, yes, but nobody, no top executives really faced the music in a criminal court.
That distinction is crucial.
It really is.
And the defense lawyers for Abacus, they actually argued something pretty powerful.
What was that?
They basically said, look, if every bank had underwritten loans as responsibly as Abacus did, maybe the 2008 crash wouldn't have even happened.
That's quite a statement. Puts a different spin on who the bad actor was.
It does. And this connects to broader policy, right? This idea of collateral consequences.
Yes, exactly. That term came up a lot, especially around Eric Holder's time as Attorney General.
So explain that. What does it mean in practice?
The basic idea was that prosecuting a really massive corporation, like a huge bank, could actually destabilize the economy.
How?
Well, the fear was it could harm, innocent employees who'd lose their jobs, shareholders who'd lose investments, and even trigger wider economic panic.
Okay, so it's like a legal version of too big to fail. Prosecuting them is just too risky for everyone else.
That's a good way to put it. And this wasn't totally out of the blue. There was history here.
Like the Arthur Andersen case.
Precisely. After the Enron scandal, Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm, was prosecuted and basically collapsed. Thousands lost their jobs.
Right, I remember that.
And maybe the KPMG prosecution around the same time, which also had issues. It led to this real reluctance, this hesitancy in the Justice Department to bring criminal charges against big companies.
So the fear of repeating the Andersen collapse kind of shaped policy?
It seems like it. And then you had these Justice Department memos, like the McNulty memo, the Phillip memo. They sort of refined the rules for getting credit for cooperating, which further nudged things away from harsh prosecutions of the corporations themselves.
And that's when we started seeing more of these alternative agreements.
Absolutely. Post-Andersen, there was this dramatic spike in deferred prosecution agreements, DPAs, and non-prosecution agreements, NPAs.
Okay, break those down. What are they?
Essentially, they're deals. The company admits some wrongdoing, pays a often large fine, agrees to implement reforms, maybe gets monitored for a while.
But avoids an actual criminal conviction.
Exactly, which means they avoid certain automatic penalties that come with a conviction, like losing licenses or government contracts.
And you said these spiked.
Oh, yeah. The numbers are telling. In 2004, there were just 5 DPAs or NPAs. By 2007, right as the mortgage crisis was really brewing, that number jumped to 41.
Wow, so a huge shift towards settling instead of prosecuting corporations.
Definitely. But what's striking is, even with all these corporate settlement happening, you saw very few high-level individuals prosecuted for the massive financial scandals of that era.
Like the people actually running these companies.
Right. Take Angelo Mazzillo at Countrywide Financial. Huge player in subprime mortgages. He himself apparently called their products toxic.
He said that.
Reportedly, yes. Made a fortune personally. But despite Countrywide's central role in the meltdown, Mazzillo faced civil penalties from the SEC, but no criminal charges.
Okay, so that's the picture at the top. Let's flip it now.
Oh.
What about individuals, especially those without means?
It's a completely different world. Think about someone like Tory Marone in New York.
What happened to him?
Arrested for possessing a tiny amount of marijuana. This was under older, stricter laws. It was just a misdemeanor, not even a felony.
Okay, so a minor offense, relatively speaking.
Right, but the bail was set at $2,500, and he just couldn't afford it.
$2,500 for weed.
Yep. So because he couldn't pay, he's stuck in jail. The punishment starts immediately, before he's even found guilty of anything, just because he doesn't have the cash.
That really highlights the barrier money creates.
It absolutely does. Now, contrast Tory's situation with, say, HSBC, the global bank.
Right.
HSBC admitted to laundering billions. We're talking maybe $7 billion for drug cartels, plus huge amounts for countries under sanction. Just staggering amounts of illicit money flowing through their system.
Billions. Okay, so what happened to them?
The consequence, a fine of $1.9 billion.
Sounds like a lot of money.
It is, but for a bank the size of HSBC, it's manageable, a fraction of their revenue.
Yeah.
And crucially, again, no individuals within HSBC faced criminal charges for this massive systemic laundering operation.
So a kid with a little bit of pot faces jail because he can't make bail, while a bank launders billions for cartels and pays a fine, and no executives go to jail.
That's the comparison the sources draw. It's pretty stark.
And this isn't just about isolated cases, is it? There are broader policing strategies involved.
Right. Things like broken windows policing. The theory is cracking down on minor offenses prevents bigger ones, but in practice,
It often hits poorer communities and minorities harder.
disproportionately, yes. Look at Andrew Brown's story. Repeatedly arrested for really minor things.
Like what?
Selling loose cigarettes, or blocking pedestrian traffic, allegedly, right in front of his own home, sometimes when there weren't even any other pedestrians around.
That sounds like harassment, almost.
It points to how these strategies can lead to constant low-level contact with the law, generating arrests for things that might otherwise be ignored.
And this leads to that phrase, the punishment is the process.
Exactly. Because even if the charges are minor, if you can't afford bail, you're punished just by being held. You could lose your job, your housing.
Just waiting for your case to be heard.
Right. And the statistics are sobering. In New York City alone, something like over 16,500 people a year end up doing, on average, 2 weeks in jail just for misdemeanors, often because they couldn't post bail.
2 weeks.
Okay.
That's enough time for your life to start falling apart.
It absolutely is. It can trap people in a cycle.
Some have described policing in certain areas as almost like commercial fishing.
Yeah, this idea of officers sort of trawling for arrestable subjects, issuing summonses for tiny infractions. Quotas might play a role sometimes, too.
And underlying all of this is the resource issue.
Always. As one public defender put it, it's a resources game. If you have money, you can afford a good lawyer, investigators, you can challenge things. If you don't,
You're reliant on often overburdened public defenders.
who do incredible work but are stretched incredibly thin. The playing field just isn't level.
Let's shift back to the financial world for a moment. The 2008 crisis wasn't just bad luck or greed, was it?
Yeah.
There were actions that seemed questionable legally.
Definitely. Things happened in these complex, maybe legally gray areas. Not just poor decisions, but potentially deceptive practices.
Lehman Brothers comes to mind. Their collapse was huge.
Monumental. And allegations surfaced about accounting tricks they used, like something called Repo 105.
Repo 105. What was that?
Basically a way to temporarily move assets off their balance sheet right before reporting periods. Made the company look less indebted, less leveraged than it really was.
So misleading investors and regulators.
That was the allegation. But despite investigations and reports detailing this, no individuals at Lehman were ever criminally charged over it.
And the fallout from Lehman, the sale of its assets.
Also controversial. When Barclays bought parts of Lehman in a rush during the crisis, there were later claims of a sort of secret discount, potentially worth billions.
Then the finning who?
Allegedly benefiting insiders at Lehman and Barclays, but at the expense of Lehman's creditors who were hoping to recover more money.
Were specific people named?
Testimony implicated figures like Bob Diamond, who later became Barclays' CEO, and Lawrence Klein, a Lehman executive. But again, the complexity, the speed of the crisis, it made accountability incredibly difficult to pin down. Exploring these kinds of complex financial dealings and their impacts is something places like Mindful Moments might delve into, encouraging that deeper look.
It really highlights how tangled these things get.
And when you combine that complexity with the collateral consequences policy and this preference for corporate settlements, you start to see how a system develops that seems skewed.
Skewed away from individual accountability at the top.
Yes. And that stands in such sharp contrast to how other laws are enforced, especially against vulnerable groups.
Like immigration law.
Absolutely. Programs like 287 GAGs and secure communities essentially turned local police in many areas into de facto ICE agents.
Leading to deportations for very minor infractions, right?
Unbelievably minor sometimes. There was that reporting case in Gainesville, Georgia, a man deported allegedly just for fishing without a license.
Fishing without a license leads to deportation.
That's what was reported. It shows how minor contact with local law enforcement could trigger severe immigration consequences.
Creating this kind of parallel legal system for immigrants.
Some have called it a giant legal purgatory. Limited rights, less due process, almost like a tracking system for removal rather than a justice system.
And you see weird inconsistencies, like that situation in Georgia.
Yeah, where a citizen driving without a license might get retroactive amnesty if they later get one, but an undocumented person doing the same thing faces jail, fines, and deportation. Same act, vastly different outcomes based purely on status.
We also can't ignore the private prison industry in all this.
No, that's a significant factor. They operate for profit, meaning their business model depends on keeping beds filled, on high incarceration rates. It adds another layer of incentive to lock people up.
Okay, let's connect two seemingly different areas, welfare and finance. The scrutiny seems uneven.
Massively uneven. Think about the experience of applying for welfare. People describe intense suspicion, intrusive home visits.
Like the stories of Maria and Karen Bjorland, welfare workers searching their homes.
Exactly. Looking for evidence of fraud, like an undeclared man living there. This even went to the Supreme Court in Wyman v. James, dealing with Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches for welfare recipients.
So intense scrutiny for those seeking maybe a few $100s in aid.
While at the same time, the financial industry, dealing in billions and trillions, was seeing massive deregulation and much less oversight, especially leading up to 2008.
There was that statistic comparing welfare fraud investigations to financial fraud.
It's staggering. In one county, reportedly 26,000 doors kicked in a year looking for welfare fraud, often over small amounts. Meanwhile, $26 billion in financial fraud from the crisis resulted in basically zero felony cases against top executives.
26,000 doors versus zero felony cases.
The scale is just hard to comprehend, and you see these Orwellian touches, like the work pays in so many ways logo on CalWorks applications, while tiny misstatements about aid can lead to harsh penalties compared to
misleading markets about billions in toxic assets.
Precisely. It can even lead to what some call reverse profiling.
What's that?
Law enforcement might actually focus more on smaller scale fraud, welfare, unemployment because it's easier to prosecute. Going after the big fish in finance is seen as too hard, too complex, too likely to fail or cause those collateral consequences.
So the path of least resistance leads them away from the biggest frauds.
That's the argument. It's a perception of impunity at the top.
Even in civil court, holding powerful financial players accountable is tough. The Fairfax financial case illustrates that, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That's a long, complicated saga. Fairfax Financial, an insurance company, basically accused a group of hedge funds of market manipulation.
Trying to drive their stock price down.
Exactly. Allegations of coordinated short selling, spreading negative rumors, even hiring investigators, supposedly former intelligence types, MI4 operatives to dig up dirt.
Dirt for what? Blackmail.
That was the implication in some of the court filings. Things like sending anonymous letters signed P-Fate to discredit the company. Fairfax sued, naming big hedge fund names like Jim Chanos and Mark Cahodes.
So what happened? It sounds like clear wrongdoing if true.
Well, the legal battle became incredibly drawn out and complex. Jurisdictional challenges, defendants with massive resources to fight back. It dragged on for years.
Showing how even a determined company like Fairfax can get bogged down.
It really shows how the civil system itself can be difficult and slow, especially when you're up against well-funded opponents who know how to use the process to their advantage. Justice delayed can feel like justice denied.
So when you pull all these threads together, abacus, collateral consequences, Toy Marone versus HSBC, Lehman, immigration, welfare checks, Fairfax, what's the big picture?
The picture painted by these sources is uncomfortable. It suggests a system where unfairness isn't just an occasional bug, but maybe closer to a feature.
A feature, you mean designed this way?
Maybe not explicitly designed top to bottom, but it's evolved into a system that systematically seems to divide people. Winners who get rich and often get off lightly.
And losers who go broke and go to jail.
That's the stark dichotomy presented. It's not just isolated incidents, but patterns suggesting systemic biases.
This exploration really does seem to reveal a disturbing double standard operating within the American justice system.
It certainly challenges the notion of equal justice under law.
And we really hope listening to this prompts some thought about the implications. What does a system like this mean for society as a whole? It goes beyond just, two Americas.
It gets into the fundamental fairness or unfairness that shapes people's lives and outcomes.
Absolutely. So we encourage you, if you found this valuable, please subscribe to our content for more analyses like this.
And share this discussion with others. Broadening the understanding of these complex issues is really important.
We'll also provide links if you're interested in purchasing the source materials or related books, which help support further investigation.
But most importantly, we hope you'll just think critically, mull over the information, question it, discuss it, consider what justice and equality truly mean in our society today.